That's a good segue, because the band that has some very interesting lyrics is who we're going to be covering tonight, and that is the Gang of Four with Entertainment. You heard in the montage Damaged Goods, and now you're going to hear a little bit of At Home He's a Tourist. All right, so that was At Home He's a Tourist from the Gang of Four's debut album, Entertainment, with an exclamation point. Matt, I wrote a note to myself this week so I didn't screw up. Will you run the numbers?
I'd be glad to. So Entertainment from Gang of Four comes in at number 86 in the 1970s on Best Ever Albums, number 5 in 1979, number 339 of all time. It is Gang of Four's highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, and it also made Rolling Stone's list, coming in at number 273.
Yeah, I was going to say, it is much higher, more highly regarded by critics than 87 in the decade. I could tell you that it made top 10s in Pitchfork and NME and I think just
decade?
outside of it in Rolling Stone for the decade of the 70s. Yes.
Wow.
So as a result, I was a little surprised to see it was that low at 87. But I guess you have to have there's certain artists that were represented about 14 times, and I think that's probably what squeezed Entertainment down.
Got to get all that Pink Floyd and Bowie in and all that stuff, John.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not arguing with it, but I'm just thinking it doesn't line up with what everybody else said. So anyway, about the band. The band's origin story is that they started in high school when guitarist Andy Gill and vocalist John King met at Seven Oaks School in London. And Seven Oaks is all one word, which I thought was very interesting. It looks very odd when you see Seven Oaks all together, as if it almost looks like it's like a Native American name or something. And I realized, no, it's Seven Oaks, just run together. Both were huge music lovers, and they were particularly partial to reggae, which I found kind of interesting, because I didn't hear a ton of reggae.
I did not either.
In this album. I heard other things, which we'll talk about in a little bit. They end up at Leeds University, where they recruit fellow student Hugo Burnham on the drums. They have an initial bassist who plays for 2 or 3 shows before they put an ad. One of the things I love, as I mentioned before, is the 60s and 70s and the 80s, where people just put ads out for bands and find people that amazingly hit often, and that's how they found their bassist Dave Allen. The ad was for a fast R&B band, and that was what brought Dave Allen into the fold, and they were then a 4-piece.
Not R&B either.
That's actually, you almost set the table for me right there, Josh, a little bit. Excellent. Because what became clear right away, I don't know, so this is mentioned often. I don't think they explicitly said this, but I think this was sort of the description that people would say about the band. So I was trying to figure out, did they describe this as what they were going for, or is this sort of the critic take of it? I think it's the critic take, but the band is described as having a rhythm section that was patterned on James Brown and Parliament Funkadelic, mixed with Gill playing a staccato version of a guitar that has elements of what we now know as noise rock. King's lyrics were often about societal problems and larger narratives, and he was particularly uninterested in what he often referred to as sloganeering. And his songs are often described as anti-love songs. He does make quite a bit of conversation about how he thought bands that, I'm kind of paraphrasing his words here, so this isn't a direct quote, but he makes a lot of comments in my research about not loving that some bands wrote about nothing but love and sex all the time, and he felt that was a little bit trite. And he said, there's so much other stuff to cover lyrically.
Knock it off, Marvin Gaye.
Stuff. I think he directed it a little bit more. It's sort of like pop music was where he was directing his ire. So the band name comes from, I actually knew this, believe it or not, which I don't know what this says about me, but the band name came from a faction of the Chinese Communist Party, who were part of the, how much do you guys know about the Cultural Revolution? Like what it was and stuff like that?
Chairman Mao.
Yeah, you know that the Cultural Revolution is one of those things where the name is nothing like what actually happened, because it basically was about stamping out culture pretty much, right? That's kind of, it was, they had the Great Leap Forward is another example of, I wouldn't say irony. It was basically how it played out and what they called it were remarkably it's not like one of those Japanese things where they come up with a really cute name for something that isn't necessarily untrue, but it's super fun toy biz. It's not like that. This is the Cultural Revolution was kind of about getting back to Chinese roots, right? But it basically was also about purging academics. Anyway, all of this stuff is important because There were a group of 4 people in that who were particularly powerful. They were cited for abuses during the Cultural Revolution. And Andy Corrigan of the band The Meekins, Mekons, we will not cover them. He was the person who actually named the group. He was who gave them the name. So, as you might imagine from a band named after a subsect of the Chinese Communist Party, referencing the Cultural Revolution, the band was quite political in nature. There were some famous other political bands who loved Gang. There are lots of bands that were influenced by Gang of Four, but bands like Rage Against the Machine and REM come up quite a bit as bands that were particularly
totally
fans of them, and obviously they both have Michael Stipe, maybe not so much in the lyrics as much as his personal stands. No pun intended. Were there, and then Rage Against the Machine as well. You just got that, Matt, huh?
Yep,
It's like that, yeah.
A little
Perfect.
slow on the uptick here.
So anyway, the Gang of Four name this album, which I'll get into like how it was recorded, but this album had some themes with it, guys. So Matt is not a lyrics guy. I know that. Did you, Josh? Did you catch some of the lyrics on this album, and did you catch any of the themes that are in here?
Yes, I did.
What do you think some of the themes are? Because I can fill in the gaps or co-sign about whether or not you're right on some of those.
Class issues. Did that come up?
It's filtered Marxist theory, and of course Marxist theory is always about class issues, so yes, you're on the correct track right there.
Yeah, I would just say dissatisfaction with the government also.
Yeah, well, how much do you know about the Situationist movement in France in the late 50s through 1972? You familiar with that?
I would know nothing about that.
I would
Gotcha,
say
well,
0.
It is I cannot summarize this in any way that would be something concise, so I'm going to say the basics here. It was described as, and I thought this sounded oxymoronic, a libertarian Marxist movement, which, boy, when you have a collectivist with a libertarian, I'm like, that's interesting.
Yeah,
it sort of was a critique of capitalism, and a lot of it was intellectuals and artists in France and in other parts of Europe. And I please know that I am paraphrasing something that I'm sure has many, many documentaries and stuff built on it as I read about this. But it seemed to be sort of a quasi-Marxist movement that was a critique of society. It was definitely left-wing, but with a very individualistic streak. There was a performative streak about it as well. Anyway, that was something. In 1968, it sort of peaked with a student-led revolution in France on campuses. Something about the year 1968, I think, was on college campuses that it was catching the world, right? Mm-hmm. But by 1972, it had pretty much petered out. I don't know, did you guys catch the album cover here? It is an interesting album cover, because it is mostly a red album cover, but then there are a series of pictures on the right-hand side.
They're shaking hands.
It's like a zoom in.
So we're going to go ahead and just directly quote what's going on here because it's impossible for me. The cover, designed by King, shows the influence of Situationist International, a group that became famous during the Paris 68 student-led revolution. It depicts and it puts in quotes, Indian shaking hands with a, in quotes, cowboy, in 3 heavily processed versions of the same image, based on a still from one of the Winnetou films starring Lex Barker and Pierre Brice, which had once been popular in communist East Germany as critical narratives of capitalism. Oh, in case you're not lost already, guys, let me give you a little bit more. The faces are reduced to
about music here?
The faces are well, because you have to, when you listen to the lyrics in this context, it does sort of make sense. So The faces are reduced to blobs of red and white. That is to stereotypical racial colors, red and white.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. A text that winds around the images reads, "The Indian smiles. He thinks that the cowboy is his friend. The cowboy smiles. He is glad the Indian is fooled. Now he can exploit him." So the idea of exploitation is something that was covered thematically in the lyrics, Josh. So you kind of nailed it right there. The back of the album, which we did not see, is also an interesting story, guys. It depicts a family whose father says, "I spend most of our money on myself so that I can stay fat," while the mother and children declare, "We're grateful for his leftovers." What do you think that is making a comment on, guys?
Capitalism?
The patriarchy. I don't know if you caught that, but yes, it's there. There also are There also are texts that say things like the facts are presented neutrally so the public can make up its own mind, and men act heroically to defend their country. And the last one, people are given what they want. So definitely Marxist feminist lenses all over this, as well as that situationist lens. So that is a huge piece of the lyrical content of this album.
Is this the most political band that we've talked about? It seems like it based on what you're been talking about.
In terms of the wide scope, I would argue yes. Now, you could argue that a lot of the reggae was political in terms of social, and you know, there's songs like by Crosby, Stills and Nash, right? You know, Ohio is a pretty political song, but in terms of as a theme for an album, I mean, there's things like Fortunate Son, right? I'm just thinking different stuff, but yeah, but in terms of a full album, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, this seems like the ethos of the band on some level, like the found.
Yeah, this is kind of like
pretty political.
The Clash is pretty, I was about to say the Clash is pretty political too. Yeah. So and they're from the same era, and that you guys keep setting me up perfectly. They first played together in 1977, and by June 1978, they had recorded their first single, which was a 3-song 7-inch. It was released on December 10th, 1978, and it contains the songs "Damaged Goods," "Love Like Anthrax," and "Armalite Rifle." A second single, "At Home He's a Tourist," you've now heard bits and pieces of 2 of those 4 songs, was released in May 1979 and was banned by the BBC for lyrical reference to condoms, which now makes it 2 consecutive weeks where prophylactics have been an issue for the BBC. Do you remember last week which other artist had a similar banning?
Because of condoms?
Because of procreation and condoms. They were kept also off the BBC and Top of the Pops.
The Buzzcocks?
Yes.
It was the Specials.
Oh, the Specials.
Too much, too young. You know, if you remember, that was a teenage pregnancy thing. So anyway, they were also kept off Top of the Pops because they refused to change the lyrics about condoms to something.
Were they okay with the drug use in that song, John? Or was it just the condoms that threw them off?
They specifically referenced that they did not want them to talk about the condoms, yes. So Entertainment is released in May 1979, and it's pretty much universally loved by critics. The album, and I won't go into too much because you guys are going to talk about it, but the album is considered to be highly influential. It is considered to be an eclectic mix of funk rhythms, jagged shards of guitar is how it was described in one thing that I read, and lyrics that were particularly political and often filtered through the Marxist theory. They sort of operate in a world in the punk scene, but also sort of outside of the punk scene is another thing that's mentioned quite a bit. So there we go. That is a little overview of Gang of Four. Let's go with Matt. You know, Matt, tell me what you think of Entertainment by Gang of Four.
Yeah, I knew nothing of this band at all. None of the songs sounded familiar, never heard of the name, so I was pretty intrigued. And yeah, I liked this a lot. This was a very, and this is an album that I liked the more that I listened to it, I would say. I think probably on the first listen or two, a lot of it kind of blended together, I found. And to some extent it still does after several listens afterwards, but and I think that's mainly one of the main sounds you get from this is the guitar tone, which is kind of like I did a little bit of reading about this, and I saw the word metallic to describe the guitar. And John, you just had a good. Would you say something about shards of guitar or something like that?
Shards of guitar, yes, which would seem to be glass or metallic in its own.
Yeah, it's got this very. There's very little. It's not much bass at all in the guitar. Not the bass guitar, but the guitar itself. It's a very kind of tinny. Kind of a sharp, it's almost like in some places it almost sounds like the guitar's not even plugged into an amp really. It's just kind of like you're hearing him just play the strings on an electric guitar with minimal amplification. But I like it. It's a raw sound, and at times it's like I don't want to say harsh, but it's aggressive, right? And the way that they play is aggressive because it's, again, more staccato guitar playing. But it is also, a lot of it is kind of couched in, different, really fast upbeat, types of beats, some cool melodies and great riffs. There's parts of this that reminded me of like stuff that the White Stripes would do in terms of the kind of like the drumming, the different drumming patterns, particularly in something like Ether. where they kind of just, they have like a drum pattern going, and then all of a sudden they go dun dun dun, and they kind of like, it throws you off a bit, and it's just got this really cool guitar or drum beat that I liked. I thought that there were some cool bass parts in here. Particularly, "Damaged Goods" is a great song. I mean, that's it. That's it, no wonder that's the one that seems to get the most plays. But that's and there's a couple of different parts happening there. Kind of switches gears a little bit, and I love that song. And there's some cool, like very cool bass lines going on there, and part of this reminds me of The Clash, and the Rage Against the Machine was interesting. I didn't think of them, but yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, this is probably a less aggressive version of that for sure, but still there is some aggression there and some anger. I mean, these guys are. It sounds like a very British album too, with the accent of the lead singer. But there's not really any duds here. It's just like I said, I think I liked it more as it went on. And yeah, it was just a kind of surprise. And I could see the influence here, right? Because it was hard to kind of pinpoint exactly who this sounds like. This is another one that kind of, I'm seeing sounds coming out in in a variety of different bands. And in that sense, it does sound a little bit ahead of its time. But yeah, big thumbs up on an album that I knew nothing about. And I'm surprised that I just never heard of them before. So I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, this album was fantastic. Again, I didn't know the band, and the first time through, I was like, okay, this was an album that grew on me the more I listened to it, and then I like started really getting into it. It kind of comes out right out of the gate with Ether, which is such like that noise rock influence is there, but they do it so well, and it's not like, it's kind of like a more tempered version of that. I don't know. I found it easier to listen to than some of the noise rock that comes later on, from this, or, as the genre evolves. But they despite all the political lyrics, and you can get some of that just from reading the song titles too, like Not Great Men or Guns Before Butter, things like that. I mean, they're not trying to hide anything, but the music for me is really what attracted me to this album. The singer's voice is really great. I thought the drums were really fantastic on this. They're kind of mixed in a way that I really wanted to like air drum with them, or I could like see where the fills were coming, or once I knew the album a little bit, I really responded to the energy that the drums brought to it. I thought it complemented the guitar. I normally would not. I agree that the guitar is kind of the most jarring piece of the band, but it really complements the other aspects of the album. I think the rhythm section in general is probably really strong. With if they're having a funk background, like you say, that makes sense, because they're just, I mean, I guess the testament to any good band is how strong their rhythm section is, because they're the foundation for everything that they do, and that allows the guitar to go all over the place when there's such like a steady undergrowth. The singer's voice is really good and complements everything, and there is no bad songs on here. I thought Damaged Goods was also great. I thought I Found That Essence Rare was an awesome song later on in the track, and Ether at the beginning was great. I hear, we talked a few weeks ago about the guitar tone from one album being everywhere that we couldn't put our finger on, but I feel like this too also carries over to later bands like The Strokes or something like Nirvana, or the way
Kurt Cobain was a big fan, in case you're wondering.
Yeah. I can imagine so. And something about the way the guitar is tuned, like Matt said, or just the way it's played, is, I feel like, something that people really glommed onto. And
yeah, there were parts of the guitar I actually felt that were kind of almost like, I forget exactly what song it was, but or which songs they were, but it's almost like a free jazz. Like it kind of goes off kilter a little bit. They kind of start doing their own thing, and it's kind of on its own beat or whatever. So it's I got a sense of like, this is a little free jazzy kind of guitar that's kind of going on.
I think they do that throughout too. The guitar does not go where you expect it to go,
right?
Or like I said, the rhythm section's playing one thing, and then it's going like all these other directions, but then comes back. I like the dueling vocals on Ether as well. it's kind of like a call and response thing. Like the lead singer says something and then the backing singer responds to it, or adds something to it. And yeah, this was just a real surprise to me. And yeah, I really liked it. I feel like it should be rated higher on the best ever albums list. I'm glad that it, I say this, or we've said this before, it's rare that we haven't heard of a band completely. Usually it's in the quote listen hot takes that those bands are discovered, but I'm glad this one is getting the respect. I feel like I should champion it more as well.
Yeah, I agree with something you guys said, which is this album, as much as any we've listened to in the 70s, rewards multiple listens. I kind of have a process of how I go. The first time I sort of listen to it loose, and I don't really write anything down. I just kind of take it in, and that one's built more on like what pops out to me. Is it the music? Are the lyrics undeniable? Is there something that affects me positively, negatively along the way? But I'm not really making a judgment as much as what are my initial sort of almost sensory things. So in that listen, I was kind of overwhelmed by, as Matt said, it's that shardy, like glass shardy sort of guitar that I always can hear as like a noise rock tone kind of. And Matt, you did a great job explaining it without having much of a bass tone at all in the guitar. And because of that, the bass pops as well.
Yep.
The drums didn't come to me quite as quick, John. Like I knew they were there, but they blended in with as a rhythm section to me more so than individual pieces. I think what happened was each time I listened, John King's voice became more nuanced to me. The first time I listened to it, it sort of blended over. It just sounded the same each time. And I wouldn't say he varies it a lot, but I learned to appreciate it within the greater context with other listens. Another thing that popped out quickly was the funk aspect. I'm surprised you guys didn't go there, because to me, that was something that popped out quite a bit. So that was the initial one. Now, the second time I listen, I sort of take notes. What do I notice that I want to talk about on the show? But also that's where I start to say, well, what does this sound like that we've covered or I'm aware of? And the two things that I wrote down quickly were Block Party and Liars.
I did think of Block Party. I forgot about that.
Bands,
yes.
But like I was like Block Party, like
Yes.
they're like a 2000s version of this, because they have the same sort of formula, even with the dueling vocals at times and stuff like that.
And the vocals of the Britishness of the vocals kind of come out in both of those as well. Yep.
And
right.
so for those that know Block Party, there's a lot of influences of a lot of people, so I don't want to draw, but that if you sort of have the sound of what Block Party sounds like, there are a lot of the same elements in this album that you would have in Block Party. The fact that this was recorded in 79, there just continues to be, I'm amazed, I think, at post-punk as a genre, I think, because these albums feel like they're from the future to some degree. Would you guys agree?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, whether it be television or magazine or Suicide, like these bands, it's very difficult to place them in the late 70s because, and another thing I realized, guys, was that these bands, these 70s bands, are so seminal to the music that we grew up listening to. It's and you start to realize, realistically, the DNA of the stuff that we listened to in the 90s and 2000s is so much more closely tied to this late 70s. And I wonder if when we get to the 80s, we're going to see the same thing. It is much more tied than sort of the 60s stuff we covered.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is big names, and we're aware of it, but by the time 90s and 2000s stuff was hitting, you really realize by taking a journey how much the 70s stuff influenced that, right? And this, you can see bits and pieces of where this came from the 60s, but really it's easier to understand as an influence to future stuff than it is to backwards look. And I think that's what's kind of amazing to me about post-punk. It's kind of like krautrock in that it doesn't really seem to be as closely tied to of the past as other music does. But yeah, and I listened to it a third time, actually, which is not always something that I do. But by the third time I was listening to it, I was picking, at that point, I really locked in on the lyrics because I was seeing stuff that was interesting to me in the earlier listens and hearing stuff. And I really focused on that. And yeah, this is a great lyrical album. I hate to use this term because it's so pompous, but it's very literate lyrics. And what I like about it is it's not like literate up your ass lyric. You know what I mean? It's like, it's literate in terms of an observational way and tying stuff in and not just, oh, look how smart I am, I know about this. I just feel they really found a nice lane of writing meaningful lyrics that weren't trite. And I know they were going for that, and I thought they really succeeded on that front. There's some really, really good lines, which maybe I'll quote a little bit later, but I want to give a chance for you guys to kick back in as well. But yeah, I really like this album. I agree. I think just for the influence alone of so many bands that I liked, it should be listened to by anyone that enjoyed alt rock or in the 80s or 90s. It was interesting because the third time I listened, I had started to do my research by that point. I didn't plan on going back a third time. And I read an All Music review where they said, it influenced so much stuff for better or worse. And they mentioned the fact that there's an influence in like rap metal. And I was like, really?
Huh.
But then when I listened, I know what they're going for, because there is, and I know they mentioned also that Flea said they were the single most important influence. And if you listen in that context, you do get it. You don't get it initially, right? And you kind of almost have to listen to it multiple times and even to some degree be listening to it, but it's there. And I heard it the first time around the funk, but then sort of you think to yourself, how could rap metal really? But then you're like, it's not a direct like correlation, but yeah, you get it, and the line was, germs of influence can be found by rap metal groups that are not in touch enough with their ancestry enough to even realize it, which I thought was an interesting way to put it. And it sounds like, Matt, you know what I'm talking about.
I'm just thinking I got to start maybe making more notes or whatever, because a lot of times I listen to these things and I'm have my headphones and I'm walking my dog, whatever, and ideas come to my head and then they flutter away because I don't know, I don't remember stuff as much as I could anyway. But the Red Hot Chili Peppers stood out to me as well, like a couple of points. I'm like, this kind of got a little bit of a Chili Peppers vibe in a certain way. Same thing with Block Party. The White Stripes stood out to me. That's one that stuck with me. But yeah, it's funny you say that because I didn't think of the rap metal, but I mean the Chili Peppers kind of they're forerunners of that. If you think about it, what came later on. So yeah, I absolutely see that. That's that's spot on.
Well, you can steal my process, Matt, if you want.
Maybe I will, John. Maybe I will.
Yeah, it's like you said, a lot of these bands from the 70s. I think that's why I'm responding to it so much. Like the 60s is kind of almost like a infancy for a lot of the genres that we listen to. Sure. And this is the point where the like tree matures and like starts to split, and then like we've known all the branches, but we haven't seen like where it all comes from.
Yeah, it's definitely expanding. I mean, there was stuff in the 60s that was like, ooh, this is different, but it was still nowhere near to what you're getting. Like once you hit like the mid 70s, it's really starting to kind of take root in a variety of different areas, and that's why, and that's what you're getting here, right? You're just getting that splinter, and it makes a lot of sense that this is more of the roots of the stuff that we listened to as kids, and even today to an extent as well. But it's going to continue to get like that too, which is kind of cool.
Is it fair to say the energy from the late 70s travels in a more modern way, I think, than the 60s energy? And I don't know why, because it's 40 some years ago, but this stuff still sounds vibrant to me. And I was thinking, is that because it influenced the stuff I listened to? But I think if you put this on to a modern teenager and put 60s stuff in, they'd hear the 60s stuff is old and the 70s stuff is interesting.
I would think
Does that make sense?
The 60s stuff, even the stuff that a lot of the 60s stuff still just while I love it, it still sounds very much of its time.
Yeah.
And this there's it's almost
and there's
like
70s stuff that says of its time too.
True,
but this is not it.
True.
This post-punk stuff is not it.
But I almost want to say that, like, I don't know how many weeks going, but it just seems like every week there's at least one album that we listen to where one of us just goes, this just either sounds ahead of its time, or it doesn't sound dated, or it doesn't sound like, I wouldn't have guessed that this was from the 70s. And it just seems like we've been doing that for a long time now, which makes it does. I don't want to take anything away from that, because I still think even though that there's maybe a lot of bands or more bands than I would have originally thought that were doing that, it still is pretty impressive. And it's a really cool thing to see and to hear, especially a band like this, which at least with television, I had heard of them and I knew a little bit of them. I knew nothing of these guys.
Oh, that was the
last
guitar
week.
tone band that I was referring to.
Yeah.
That we had talked about. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but at least I had heard of it. This is like, wait, who? What? Like,
We kind of have to admit that, like, we kept saying that, and really, do we just have to say that a lot of good post-punk doesn't necessarily sound ahead of its time? It's just a really good time. I think that's what I've come to realize. And it's maybe it's not like when you listen to the Stooges or that early Zeppelin album, right, where you're like, this is 10 years ahead, and there's no other part of the genre or the Velvet Underground, right? There's no other surrounding genre that sounds like that. I think what I thought was, as we start listening to these bands, ooh, they sound ahead of their time too. But then you realize when there's a whole genre built around this, it's just, maybe it's when post-punk is where we all sort of recognize a shift into modernity that is familiar to us.
Well, and dare I say, is this something that could be considered timeless? Is this like a
if you're
timeless
into
type of genre.
If you're into alternative rock, or what we would call indie rock or alternative rock, I think yes.
Yeah.
If you don't listen to rock, I don't know, because you might say, oh, that guitar rock stuff, is of its time, But yeah, if you're into like indie rock and alt rock to this day,
because even though rock isn't as nearly as viable a genre as it was, back in the 70s, if you're into rock, like you said, if you're into rock today and somebody played this for you, like, you could have fooled me. This could have been an album that came out last week. Like, another band? I just thought of it. Parquet Courts was another band that I was reminded of when I heard this. Kind of that minimal, because it's got that minimalist, garage rock kind of tone. And Parquet Courts, even though I think they're American, but I found that they sounded similar to them as well. And that's a very recent band. Well, relatively recent band anyway.
Well, it also weaves into enough genres that it could exist in this world too, because a lot of what the remnants of rock are, right, is a mix with something that has more credibility, whether it's hip hop or funk or what I'm saying, or Latin music. The things that bring in those elements back in the day sound more modern, I think, as well, because you very rarely see like a standalone 3 or 4 piece band anymore. If you're sort of doing, and that's where I think things like adding in some of the funk, adding in a little bit of the tone, the noise rock, it makes it seem a little bit more of a different era.
Yeah, maybe post-punk in of itself is just more resistant to the trends. For some reason, maybe that genre as a whole just carries through. I wonder if we're gonna feel the same way in the 80s when we cover something.
That's what I'm very curious about, because we're gonna go into all kinds of other genres, and I'll be interesting. It's also going to be interesting hearing them after basically traveling. I keep saying this over and over, but traveling the walk, where we've heard all of this stuff that leads up to it. By accident, we're stumbling into through lines, I think, that we probably wouldn't have been smart enough on our own to figure out. But now there's 3 of us, talking this stuff out. It's like, how about that? I get that, stuff like that. So, yeah, high recommend for me. I like this one quite a bit.
Same.
Agreed.